humidity. Welcome to the Kernstown battlefield. Thank you all for coming. A nice crowd today. 50-something people signed up. This is great to see. I'm Larry Turner. I'm the current Vice President of the Association. I want to thank you on behalf of the Board of Directors. And I think you're in for a real treat. How many people have not been on the second Kernstown tour with Scott? Brand new? You folks are in for a treat. This guy is the consummate expert on the 1864 Valley campaign, the last Battle of Winchester, and the Civil War, French and Indian War. He's got books for sale on Colonel Thoburn's Worthy of Higher Rank, an excellent book. It's his diary that he published, a journal that he edited, and so books are for sale that he signed. If you want that, we have books over here for donation. Grab a box, fill it, give us a donation, and give them a good home. We have 2 new cannon barrels that are donated, a 24-pound flanker howitzer and a 3-inch Ordnance rifle donated by Harry Ridgway recently. And okay, so things to see around here. Bathrooms are the next building to my left down here. Little to book sale, new cannons. Anybody consider volunteering for us in sometime in your life. We always need volunteers. You can see Chuck. We don't charge admission for any of this stuff. We run purely on donations, so if you please consider joining or donating. Your money goes to 100% good cause. None of us are paid. Today, we're going to make 4 stops. Scott's going to give you an introduction and all the background leading up to the battle, and we're going to go to the top of Pritchard's Hill, get some Union perspective there and terrain orientation. Then we're going to go to the south, Mulligan's Advance by the Patchan Presbyterian Church. Then we're going to switch over to the Confederate perspective to a side we call the sharpshooters, one of their tactics. And he'll pick up the Confederate attack onto a wall, and we'll end it up here on the Pritchard's Lane at Colonel Mulligan's final stand. Okay? Any questions on admin? Okay. Without further ado, I want to introduce Scott Patchan. Like I said, you guys are in for a treat. Thank you, Scott. Yep.
All right, good morning. Yeah, I told a couple people already, we're normally already pushing 90 degrees on this anniversary at 9 o'clock in the morning and unbearable heat by the time we wrap up around noon. So this promises, to be weather-wise one of the best days I've ever had out here at this time of the year. What I like to do before I dive more into the details of this particular battle is to discuss, first of all, the big picture here, the Shenandoah Valley. Shenandoah Valley, the way it sits geographically, if you're looking on it on a map, it kind of runs from northeast to southwest. And that favors the south because Southern armies advancing down the valley, down is north in the Shenandoah Valley, they're moving closer to Washington, D.C. But the Union armies, who were main objective is going to be Richmond, as they move up the valley, kind of southwest, it's taking them away from Richmond. So you've got that geographic. One thing that, when I talk, though, I'm going to generally, if I say north, I know north is more that way, but the Valley Pike kind of runs at an angle there. So, but north is going to be, I'm referred generally towards Winchester. South would be towards the Lexington, Stanton area, generally speaking. West is the Allegheny Mountains, and east is the Blue Ridge. But it's also, the valley is a vital source of food, grains. It's called the breadbasket of the Confederacy. Although the agricultural surveys do show that as the war goes on, one thing, there's a lot of farmers here, yeoman farmers out here. They're not having their farms worked by slaves. And so what's going to happen is when most of these men go off and join the Army, there will be significant declines in the agricultural productivity of the Shenandoah Valley. And as campaigns go in, that's going to impact it ever more. But the Valley is going to be, for the Union throughout, from beginning to end, a source of problems, a distraction. Because A, you've got the Lincoln administration in Washington, D.C., that when things start happening up there, they know that Confederate armies pop up over on the north side of the Potomac and threaten Washington, D.C., and as they're going to do a few times during the war. In 1861, there's going to be a large force out here under General Joe Johnston, Confederate Army of the Shenandoah. This is famous Stonewall Jackson is a brigade commander. He's not a senior officer in this army, but he's going to be out here in 1861 as part of Johnston's army. Opposing him over north and then up in the Martinsburg area is going to be a Union army under the command of General Patterson. There will be some skirmishes in the early summer, and Patterson's going to kind of go dormant there. And this is going to have a major impact on the outcome of the first battle, the Battle of Bull Run or Manassas on July 21st of 1861. Because of lack of Union activity, Johnston's going to be free to march his army down to Paris, Virginia, and march to the Manassas Gap Railroad and take that to Manassas Junction. His troops are going to be necessary to turn the tide of battle. It's going to be Stonewall Jackson and his Valley men on Henry Hill is going to make that famous stand with their stands Jackson like the stone wall that turns the tide. So the Valley, from the very beginning of the war, is playing a key role. You see this. In 1862, not the largest, but probably certainly the most famous, is Stonewall Jackson's 1862 campaign. He's out here on March 23rd of 1862, launches his attack against the division of James Shields under the command of Colonel Nathan Kimball, and he's defeated. Well, Shields, even though he wasn't on the battlefield and was wounded in a house in Winchester, he's going to be sending exaggerated reports back to Washington, D.C., and every one, he accomplished more and more on Jackson's size and strength, tripling and quadrupling the number of men that Jackson had, creating much more consternation of what threat Jackson posed and what he actually had the capability of doing. And so troops are going to begin, that had left the Valley, are going to start coming back here. Jackson's whole campaign will be one of deception. And once again, the Shenandoah Valley is going to impact the Major League campaign, and that's George McClellan versus Johnston and Robert E. Lee in the Peninsula campaign, where it comes up, gets to the gates of Washington, of Richmond, and then Robert E. Lee takes command when Joe Johnston is wounded at the Battle of Seven Pines, and launches his attacks several weeks later in the battles of the 7 days, hammering McClellan back to Harrison's Landing. One of the key things there is troops that had been earmarked for McClellan are going to be out here in the Shenandoah Valley instead. And so it's going to make a difference in the outcome. It would be one of the main reasons McClellan would cite. Although there are historians who studied McClellan, and they would argue, well, what would he have done with those men even if he had them? Because he had a reputation of being very slow-moving in things. But again, it certainly impacts it, and Jackson plays a key role in saving Richmond through his actions from March through early June of 1862 out here in the Shenandoah Valley. In 1863, the Shenandoah Valley is going to serve as an avenue of invasion. After the Battle of Chancellorsville, in which Robert E. Lee lost Stonewall Jackson, his right arm, he would reorganize his army under 3 corps, and most of Jackson's old Second Corps is under Dick Ewell. And Ewell will lead the Army of Northern Virginia, and he'll be in the vanguard coming out here through the Shenandoah Valley. There's a large, fairly large Union detachment of about 8,000 men stationed at Winchester under General Robert Milroy. And in mid-June of '63, Ewell will rout him, capture thousands of men, dozens of pieces of artillery from him, and clear the way so that the rest of the army can cross the Potomac on their way to their date with destiny at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania in the beginning of July of 1863. There'll be rear guard actions as when Lee falls back from Gettysburg in the Shenandoah Valley as well. There's always, throughout the war, partisans. John Mosby, his men would be active in parts of the northern Shenandoah Valley. Cavalry raids periodically through late '63 and early '64 especially. Now in 1864, things are going to change significantly in the Shenandoah Valley. And that has to do directly to Abraham Lincoln's appointment of Ulysses S. Grant as the Supreme Commander of the United States Army. Grant's going to have a different philosophy. Previously, the individual Army and department commanders across the entire South were kind of all operating on their own hook. There was no coordination. Grant sought to change that. He's going to have George Meade with the Army of the Potomac moving in the overland campaign, the battles of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, all the way down to the siege of Petersburg. He's also going to have, starting in, and this is all designed to start the first week of May of 1864. Brigadier General Benjamin the Beast Butler has the Army of the James, and he's going to be moving up the James River against the force under Beauregard there. In Georgia, we will have Sherman leading his army in North Georgia, just south of Chattanooga, with his goal is Joe Johnston's Army of Tennessee and the capture of the Gate City, Atlanta. Further west, out in the Trans-Mississippi, we have Nathaniel Banks. Banks, who was one of Stonewall Jackson's whipping boys here in the Shenandoah Valley in 1862. He has already embarked on a campaign called the Red River Campaign that would fail. And so Grant had hoped to actually use that army to move against Mobile, but before that campaign was too far underway to change its objectives and send it against Mobile. But you see what Jackson's doing is, what Grant's doing is he's trying to keep the pressure on all fronts. He doesn't want to see things happen like they did in 1863, where after the Battle of Gettysburg, Meade is very docile with the Army of the Potomac, and Grant sends Longstreet's entire corps to North Georgia, which results in a major Confederate victory at the Battle of Chickamauga. So Grant's trying to stop all of that reinforcement of the Confederates, to hold them, pin them down everywhere at once. The same thing is going to happen out here in the Shenandoah Valley. Grant, unfortunately, has out here General Franz Sigel, who's probably not as bad as the general if you've heard of him. His not that bad. Sometimes people are either, as in history, we have them up on pedestals, way up on a pedestal, or way down here on, but everyone's kind of probably, a little exaggerated in those directions. And Siegel's one of those guys, but he was very popular amongst the German American community. And that was vital in states like Kentucky and Missouri that kept them in the Union, but not to mention large population centers in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and throughout what we now call the Midwestern states. So because of that constituency, Lincoln needed to put Sigel in a somewhat of an important command. So he will be given command here of the Department of West Virginia, which included the Shenandoah Valley. And what happens there is Grant, Sigel by '64 is a known quantity. It's not like it's 1861 and you've got nobody really has significant military experience, and you're rolling the dice all the time, but politics put in there. But Grant reasoned, he said, well, maybe he can hold the leg down while someone else does the skinning. And well, didn't work out that well. He let go of the leg and got kicked in the backside by John Breckinridge at the Battle of Newmarket on May 15th of 1864. Grant will immediately relieve him of command and place General David Hunter, who will win the victory at the Battle of Piedmont. He'll be reinforced by troops under George Crook coming from West Virginia, and he will journey all the way south through Lexington, Virginia, where he will burn Virginia Military Institute and Governor Letcher's home, and then continue on through the Blue Ridge Mountain and Peaks of Water, and hopefully capture Richmond. His chief of staff, David Hunter Strother, wrote in his journal, he said, they thought they were doing real well, but Hunter prophetically wrote in his journal, he said, nothing less than a corps from Lee's army can save Lynchburg now. Well, Lee knew how important Lynchburg was because there's a railroad running up from Southwest Virginia and East Tennessee, the Orange and Alexandria Railroad, which connects the Virginia Central from the Valley to Richmond, goes down the Lynchburg, and running east, there's a railroad running east, the South Side Railroad out of Lynchburg that supported a town that suddenly took on immense military proportions in June of 1864, Petersburg. The same time that Hunter's showing up at Lynchburg, Grant is laying siege to Petersburg for the first day. Robert E. Lee has only 50,000 available infantry in his army at this point in June with all the heavy losses. And that's including, he's now consolidated Beauregard's force from the James River in with him. And he's going to detach 20%, 10,000 men, first 2,500 men under John C. Breckinridge, who had gone from the Valley to reinforce Lee. They're going to get sent out here. And then another 8,000 men under the command of Jubal A, who's taken over command of the old Second Corps. Some of Jackson's troops were here, but what had been a full division under Jackson was now a brigade that numbered only 1,000 men because of the heavy losses they had incurred in the wilderness in Spotsylvania, where the division had basically been wrecked. But Early's going to be out here, and he's going to arrive in Lynchburg in a nick of time to save it from capture. Hunter is going to retreat into the mountains of West Virginia through Roanoke Valley and up to Charleston, West Virginia. And his plan is he's going to put his army on riverboats. Well, the river was low, and there were sandbars they couldn't pass, and they were stopping and having to march around. And that's going to give Jubal Early enough time to get his army down the Shenandoah Valley, cross the Potomac River, win the Battle of Monocacy on July 9th, and show up at the gates of Washington on the 11th of July, 1864. Now, there was a staff officer in that army. He was serving on the staff of Early's second in command, Major General John C. Breckinridge. Who, I'll give you a little bit of his background because we'll be talking about him out here on the Kernstown battlefield. Breckinridge had been Vice President of the United States during the Buchanan administration, and until October of 1861, he was a sitting senator from Kentucky, working, still trying to hope to find some compromise to keep the country together. He would only go over to the Confederacy. He went home to Kentucky, and then some hardcore Unionists decided that he was a traitor, and they raised a plot to arrest him, and Breckinridge got word of this, and he went south to Tennessee at that point. His biographer, William C. Davis, said he was almost pushed into the Confederacy at that point. Breckinridge had also been he was the Southern Democrat presidential candidate in the 1860 election, where you had a split. You had Douglas was the Northern Democrat, Breckinridge the Southern. They split the Democratic vote, and that's how Abraham Lincoln got elected in 1860. So at Breckinridge had this young staff officer named Captain James Clay. His grandfather was Henry Clay. He was sort of the great compromiser with Webster and Calhoun and things. This is his grandson. And he writes a letter home to his mother when the army's right in front of Washington, D.C., and he tells her, we're in sight of the dome of the United States Capitol here. He says, we're closer to their capital than they've ever been to ours. That says it all in the big picture for Abraham Lincoln in 1864. He's running for re-election in November of 1864. He's trying to run a campaign that says, we're winning this war, we're going to see it through to victory. It doesn't look very victorious when your main armies bogged down in front of Petersburg in the bloodiest campaign of the war. And the enemy has a sizable force, just a couple of miles from the United States Capitol. In the end, reinforcements Grant sends to Washington will show up, and Early will retreat back into the Shenandoah Valley. He'll fight a rear guard action on July 18th at Cool Spring or Snickers Gap, where he'll defeat the Union effort to flank him out of his position. The only setback in Early's entire movement from the time he went out to Lynchburg to return to the valley is going to happen on July 20th, a couple miles north of Winchester at the Battle of Rutherford's Farm. You could call it now the Battle of Chick-fil-A, McDonald's, so hungry men fighting over food. Anyway, it was Rutherford's Farm, and this battle occurs because Early knew he had to retreat with all these reinforcements Grant had sent, and then Hunter's men have arrived back in the valley, so he's falling back farther south in the Shenandoah Valley, and he sends a aggressive young North Carolina Major General Stephen Ramseur to Winchester with specific orders to cover the removal of supplies and wounded from Winchester. Well, he's aggressive. He's just recently been promoted to Brigadier General, and he's a great guy. He's the attack dog on the leash that you generally need. That he was used to having that division commander say, "Okay, go." He doesn't have that here. He's on his own. He's going to get reports of a small Union force moving southward. Well, it was a small force. Ramseur outnumbered it 2-1, but he against his orders, because they gave him orders that said, stay on the defensive, don't go looking for fights. Well, he goes looking for a fight, and the skillful New Yorker against him, Brigadier General William Woods Averill, a cavalryman who has trouble being effective in getting along with others when he's operating within the confines of a larger army, but when he's an independent command in West Virginia and things like Shenandoah Valley here where he's on his own, he's fantastic. And he whips him in no time, and it's a very embarrassing situation. It's the only defeat that Early suffered during that campaign. He lose several hundred men and a battery of artillery that was captured there. After that now, things are going to change. The Union commander in the Department of West Virginia, Hunter, he's a headquarters commander now on Harper's Ferry. And George Crook, an Ohioan, has command of what was called the Army of West Virginia. And Crook will, and Hunter, they're going to get information that tells them that Early has been recalled to Richmond, and he's on his way to Richmond. And they accept that. Crook is normally a very cautious guy, but he's up and down like a lot of people, good days and bad days. And probably his worst day is coming here. On July 22nd, he is going to send a communication back to his commander, General Hunter, and the War Department, and let them know that at this point his army, all the reinforcements are marching back to Washington, D.C. And he's probably got 12, maybe 13,000 men. These guys those that are there are worn out. They marched through, some of them marched from Charleston down to the Wytheville area in the spring, then back up to Lewisburg, and then came over to Stanton, and then the whole army, Lynchburg, Charleston, Ohio River, railroads, and then they're worn out. There's several surgeons that commented on this, including Colonel Joseph Dover, who's an infantry division commander, but was by trade a physician. He wrote that 30 days' time will not be enough to restore this army to full health. I think it went to Lynchburg with 18,000 men. Of those, it's about 1,000, maybe 1,200 that become casualties during the campaign. But even with reinforcements, a few thousand reinforcements added in, Crook's only got 12,000 men here. So you have thousands of men have been left in hospitals from Charleston to the Ohio River all the way out to Martinsburg because they were physically broken down and unfit for service. Crook recognizes this on July 22nd. He also recognizes that, if Early's still here, he's too strong for me to meet. And Crook generally relies on his scouts here. But things are going to change on July 23rd. Jubal Early at this point, he's fallen back just south of Strasburg, Fisher's Hill, and his men are camped there. July 23rd was for his army a day of rest. It was a respite that the men seldom got. So they rested, they did laundry, they sewed torn uniforms, got themselves prepared, and just relaxed. Well, the Confederate cavalry, they're going to move northward. 3 brigades under the command of Brigadier General John Vaughn. They're going to do a reconnaissance in force. There's going to be some back and forth cavalry action between Kernstown and where the interchange with 37 and 81 is there, back and forth. From prisoners, the Confederates are going to learn that all the reinforcements are en route or at Washington, D.C. So Early gets this information, and the timing of this couldn't have been better because Robert E. Lee had sent him a message that basically says, you could stay out there and campaign in the Shenandoah Valley, but Early had one assignment if he does that. That is, all those troops that Grant had sent up to Washington, D.C., which was the 6th Corps, about 12,000 men. The 19th Corps, which at this time was only a few thousand men. The 19th Corps was originally, it had operated with Banks down in the Red River campaign. They were put on boats in New Orleans, and their destination was City Point, which is basically the docks and the port for Petersburg for Grant's operations. And instead, he sent them on up the Chesapeake Bay to Washington, D.C. as further reinforcements when Early invaded. So all those troops, Lee's like, hey, I can't fight those guys here, and if they come back here, you have to come here. So Early decides right away when he learns it's just George Crook left in the Shenandoah Valley on July 24th, he is going to attack. He's going to march his whole army. It's about 16,500 strong, 10,000 infantry, about 5,000 cavalry, and the rest artillery included as well. So that is how we're going to go and get out onto the battlefield. Now before I start that, I'll just do just a couple brief backgrounds on the 2 primary commanders. First I'll start with Brevet Major General George Crook. Crook had West Pointer from what's the area that's now encompassed by Dayton, Ohio. Had been out on the West Coast fighting against Native Americans, and by the time the Civil War breaks out, he's got an arrowhead lodged in his hip from the actual combat experience that he had. He would start off as a colonel of the 36th Ohio Infantry. It wasn't a regiment he raised, but this regiment had kind of fallen into disarray and poor leadership. And Crook, being a regular Army guy, taught him the drill, instilled discipline, and turned this into a fine regiment. In fact, they were known as Crook's Regulars. And they would fight and fight well at several very famous battles: South Mountain, Antietam, Chickamauga, Chattanooga, and they would be heavily engaged in all of these and always perform well. So this unit is by far your most elite unit in Crook's entire army. Crook has only one problem. Most of his infantry are from the Army of Northern Virginia. 8,000 of those 10,000. They're from the Second Corps Army of Northern Virginia, and they've got just as much experience, whereas most of Crook's guys prior to 1864 have seen some scattered service. A few regiments have been attached to the main army here and there, but most of the time they've been guarding the railroad, Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, through western Maryland, through West Virginia, and on up to the Ohio River, chasing down raiders and things. So they do not have the, it becomes more of a numbers game there in terms of the caliber of the experience, even though Early's army is much smaller. To give you an example of the attrition of Early's army, he commanded the division at the Second Battle of Winchester in June of 1863 that fought right here on this same ground. He had about 8,000 men in his division of Dick Ewell's corps, which was over 20,000 men going in, I think 23,000 or so going up to Gettysburg. The Second Corps in 1864 at Second Kernstown got to be 8,000 men. So you just see the attrition that has occurred. He's now a corps commander, but in terms of the size of what he has, it's really about the same size of what he had in 1863. George Crook, he would fight first at Lewisburg, West Virginia, win a victory there. He would serve at South Mountain, Antietam. Antietam was kind of a foggy day for him. It said Crook could be up and down. But he would be sent west with his regiment, and his regiment would join the Army of the Cumberland under Rosecrans and serve in the infantry. Crook would receive command of a cavalry brigade, and he would do well in the latter part of 1863, repelling Confederate cavalry raids and chasing them down in Tennessee under the command. Those were under the command of Joseph Wheeler. He would come east in 1864, lead a raid down into southwest Virginia against the Virginia and Tennessee Railroad. He'd win the Battle of Cloyd's Mountain on May 9th. And he's a very well-organized guy. He's up and down. July 22nd, he's got everything kind of lined up. My force isn't strong enough. Early could still be here. But I think it may have as much to do with he did have a lot of respect for the cavalrymen who were reporting back to him on the 23rd about this, that this is a large Confederate cavalry force here. So he starts thinking, these guys, he didn't trust them, Averell and Duffier, and he's going to let his guard down here. And we'll talk what happens out on the battlefield. Jubal Early's an interesting character. He's known as Robert E. Lee's bad old man. He too is a West Pointer. He had seen some time in the Army, Seminole Indian Wars. He got sick and never really was able to participate much in the war with Mexico. One of the early formative stories of him is in the late 1830s. He had met this beautiful woman on one of the resorts at Springs it was White Sulphur Springs in southwest Virginia, and they were going to meet there again. And when the time came for him to meet her for the next visit, shortly before then, she was from Philadelphia, and he received a letter in the mail, and all it had was a clipping from the newspaper announcing this beautiful Livonia's wedding to another man. And it was said that he spurned women for the rest of his life, which he did to an extent, but he fathered 4 children with one woman in Rocky Mountain. So, never married her though. At one point after the war, she had an offer of marriage from another man, and the story is old Jube, she approached him and said, well, if you want to marry me, I'll marry you, but this guy's giving me an offer. And basically said, take it. But early in 1861, he commands a brigade in the counterattack at the First Battle of Manassas. He's going to rise up. He'll be wounded at the Battle of Williamsburg in 1862. And that's going to kind of change his assignment. When he returns, he gets another Virginia brigade, but this time he's going to be under Stonewall Jackson. He'll play key roles at the Battle of Cedar Mountain, Second Manassas, Antietam, at Fredericksburg. When Union troops break through Jackson's line east of town there, it's going to be Jubal Early's division that counterattacks and drives back the Pennsylvania reserves who have broken through. He's going to continue on, helps clear north of Gettysburg on the first day of the battle there. Some of his troops would be engaged at Cemetery Hill. He'll be engrossed in controversy over Gettysburg, some about him, some he created about others for the rest of his life. But he's going to continue on as a division commander, performs very well at the Battle of Wilderness. Then A.P. Hill gets sick. He's going to take over the 3rd Corps for the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, where Dick Ewell doesn't do so well. So what is eventually going to happen by the time June rolls around, Robert E. Lee's going to send Ewell to Richmond to recover. And Early gets the 2nd Corps, and that's when he goes out to Lynchburg to start. So Early is significantly more experienced as a field commander. Again, he served closely under Stonewall Jackson, albeit not out here in the Shenandoah Valley, but with the main Army of Northern Virginia in 1862-63. So he's very experienced and capable, and we're now going to go out and see some of his work. Any questions on any background or anything?
Hey, Scott, I do, but how did Second Corps get from Richmond to Lynchburg?
They're going to take the Virginia Central Railroad out to the Gordonsville, Charlottesville, and then go south. Once they start going south from there, Dufier's cavalry has sporadically, they went east of the Blue Ridge and they broke it up. So they were kind of like hunter's men with the riverboats, where they'd have to get off and march around some of the broken, wait for repairs. And so it's actually, when the actual combat occurs, there's going to be probably 1/3 of Early's force isn't even in Lynchburg until after all the combat.
It was partial by rail, partial by foot?
Yes, yeah.
Hey, Scott. Yeah, what was the regiment that you said Crook had that was experienced?
36th Ohio. Yeah. There's some others. The 23rd Ohio has some experience, but not to the extent of the 36th. Again, your typical regiment in Crook's command. One regiment fought at Kernstown and Fort Republic. A few of them fought under Milroy at the Second Battle of Winchester. Some of them really, other than guerrilla fighting and guarding the railroad. You know, when Grant determined to have all these active operations, he stripped a lot of garrisons and said, hey, we're going to go on the offensive, and you know, the enemy's not going to be able to do these things. So, anything? Yes?
Yeah, when Early comes to Lynchburg and Hunter retreats, if Hunter had been there like a half a day earlier, would he have been able to hold out anyway?
Well, I don't think the idea was never to hold Lynchburg.
Just to destroy.
The idea was to get there for a couple of days and wreak havoc on the railroad, the warehouses. You know, there was also major hospitals there, canals on the James River. You know, it was to wreak havoc on that. I don't think it was ever. And the other thing to keep in mind too is, you know, Hunter's out there. He had general information that Phil Sheridan might have been joining him, but Sheridan was defeated at Trevilian Station. So, you know, there's no communications either. It's doubtful. I don't know. None of the journals mention being aware. You know, Grant, what does he start, like the 15th or 16th at Petersburg, and they arrive at Lynchburg on the 17th? And so they don't even know that Grant's down that railroad to the east. I mean, you could look at it and say, oh, look, video game, oh yeah, we could take Lynchburg and march east and join Brig, but they don't know what's happening. Anything else? All right, well, let's head up.
One, couple admin things I forgot to mention. I'm gonna bring this on the tour of statistics of who comes and where you've heard from us are important for getting grants. So I'm gonna pass this around as around on the tour. So we really, if you're new, there's a blank sheet on the back to sign in, and we'd really like to know where you heard about us. That's important. Second, we've got 2 golf carts. Anyone who has mobility issues, we've got 2 seats in the white one. Scott and I'll be on the white one over here. And Steve Chesley's gonna drive this green one out here, but it's got 5 seats in it. If there's more than 7, then we'll just shuttle back and forth. And we'll get everybody to the top of the hill. Length of the walking is about 2 miles today with 4 stops. Okay, so if you need help, we're there for you. So just let us know.